Good evening. Welcome to this Foundation for Science and Technology event on increasing interdisciplinarity in UK R&D. We're a bold, forward-looking, innovative organisation, so we are meeting in a different room at the Royal Society. You can't get more radical and imaginative than that. We're breaking down the barriers, which is what this evening is all about. It's marvellous that we have four excellent speakers on interdisciplinarity. I have to say that the origins of this event on this subject came from a meeting of the UKRI board where Ottelin Liza, who we will be hearing from in a moment, spoke with great passion on the subject. And I know Ottelin personally is very committed to it. It was in many ways one of the founding principles of UKRI, something that Paul Nurse in his original report picked up as a weakness of the British science system and wanted to see interdisciplinarity properly recognised and funded. So we thought, especially with the allocations of UKRI's budgetary allocations about to be released, now would be a good moment to hear from Ottelin herself, and then we have three other excellent speakers. Ottelin is, of course, the Chief Executive of UKRI and also Regius Professor of Botany at the University of Cambridge. She has a distinguished research background in agri-science. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society, a member of the Leopoldina, and an international member of the US National Academy of Sciences. Ottelin, you're very busy. We are highly committed. Thank you so much for coming here this evening to talk to us.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And it's good to be here. And indeed, as David said, interdisciplinary research and innovation, indeed, is something I care about very passionately, and I think increasingly important for a whole range of reasons. So it's great to be talking about them. There's lots and lots of discussion in lots and lots of fora about interdisciplinarity, and I'm looking forward to the debate precisely because I think people come at it from different directions, and that's good because that's kind of interdisciplinary. But how one then marshals all of that together to do something, I think is even more important. Okay, so why do I think it's important? So we have in the UK this extraordinary track record in research and innovation right across disciplines and right across sectors, and as a country I think we're quite unusual in that respect. We're not unique but quite unusual, and then we're quite a small country with this broad depth across things, and as a result I think if we can work through creative coordination and agility, we really have an opportunity to move things forward quickly, which is very exciting. And to do that, we have to get good at interdisciplinarity. And I think UKRI is a critical asset in all of this, precisely because we bring together all of the disciplinary research councils with Research England that funds block grants into English universities in very close collaboration with the equivalent bodies in the devolved administrations, and of course Innovate UK, the UK's innovation agency, and that's exactly the kind of thing you need, that join up across the system to be able to support the interdisciplinary agenda in the context of that really high quality disciplinary research and innovation. So as I said, everybody says it's important. I'm not even going to bother trying to define it because it's virtually impossible, and I think this is a really important point. It's virtually impossible to define in a robust way, and it is even harder as a result to measure it in a robust way. And that means actually a lot of the discussion underpinning the whole thing is based much more on what people feel almost than it is on hard evidence. So everybody thinks it's extraordinarily difficult to do, but the evidence that that's the case is problematic in my view. Now, partly it's problematic because once people get to the point where they can't define it, they then kind of lump it all together in one big thing called interdisciplinarity. And I think there are several quite distinct things that we need to think about, and what we need to do to support them is quite different in each case. And they are not all the same beast. And I like to think of it in three pots. You can divide it up different ways. The place where I have the most personal experience is research, where the question you're trying to address is absolutely core in a particular discipline. It's not an interdisciplinary question. It's a question that is a burning question to answer in a core discipline that everybody would recognize. But in order to answer it, you need things from other disciplines. And so I worked for many years computationally modeling plant developmental biology. And so I had to learn to talk with mathematicians and computational scientists so that we could build the shared language we needed to address the questions I was interested in developmental biology. Fortunately, they were excited about those questions too, partly because they also had questions in their disciplines that they felt would be helped by learning something about plant biology. I had a very, I remember a very early meeting in my journey when I was working at the University of York with the very wonderful Susan Stepney, who is interested in biologically inspired computational architectures. So she was very interested in working on biological systems and how they work. So it was a match made in heaven from that point of view. And I was in my office talking to her about the model I had for how shoot branching control works in plants, which I really care about. And she said, "Oh, that's very interesting. What language is that written in?" And I had to say English. And yes. So many years later, it was written in L systems, but that's a whole different story. So that's the kind of journey you have to go on, and it takes time and effort, but everybody is very anchored in their disciplinary route, and so the challenges are different from the other two categories I would highlight, one of which is challenge-led research, where what you're trying to do is solve a problem in the world, like some of the big climate change problems, these kinds of things, where you definitely will need inputs from multiple disciplines to solve that particular problem. So everybody comes together to do that, bringing their independent disciplinary expertise with them. And that's a very different sort of thing, because you're working in a broad team, everybody pointing at the same problem, whereas what I've just talked about was people pointing at different problems, but they're mutually benefiting from talking to one another. And then the category I actually worry about the most is where you're practically inventing a whole new discipline or something like that at the boundary between disciplines, so nobody is in their home turf, because you're doing something so new and different that you just don't know what it is. And that one I think is hardest to get to, because everybody is somewhere new and unexplored. So, as I say, everybody says it's important, everybody says it's difficult, and it turns out to be difficult, I think, at least as much because of the kind of feelings people have about how difficult it is as in the context of real barriers. And the feelings create the barriers in cycles which are unhelpful. There are also some genuine difficulties, but I think they're overcomable if one zooms out, thinks about the different categories differently, and asks the broader questions about what you need to do to help people feel more comfortable moving into the spaces. So the topics people raise are on funding, how you get together the right group of people with the right mindset to assess a proposal that is interdisciplinary, and I would say it's different in those three categories. How you assess a publication, both in the context of getting it published in the first place or in the context of something like the REF, where you're looking at people's published outputs. Again, I would say it's different in those different contexts. Both of those things are largely about assessment, and of course assessment feeds crucially into the career decisions people make and the career possibilities people have. And so all of this underpins career progression issues. And at this point, I'm going to take a whistle-stop diversion into the recently published UKRI strategy. I'm not just plugging my strategy, although I'm also doing that. I'm to me, this list of things is at the nexus of a huge number of challenges we face in the research and innovation system, and the difficulties we have with interdisciplinarity are just one massive manifestation of those things. And if we think about it only as a problem with interdisciplinarity, we will not get to the point where we have the root cause that we can fix. So UKRI, as I said, it brings together the disciplinary research councils with Research England and Innovate UK. Our vision is to build an outstanding research and innovation system for the UK that gives everyone the opportunity to contribute and from which everyone can benefit for a whole variety of reasons, enriching lives locally, nationally, and internationally. And we have a number of tools at our disposal to do that. We can convene and catalyse, but obviously we can invest. We need to collaborate across the system to do that, to build this thriving, inclusive system that connects different parts of the system together, discovery to prosperity and public good. And our analysis of what isn't working, what needs to change, that underpins how our strategy will be implemented, and indeed the choices we've already made in that context, have to do with the very things which, in my view, are the cause of the problem with interdisciplinarity. So we have built a highly competitive system. There are science and research in general will always be competitive. There are more good ideas than there is money to fund them. It will be competitive, but the rules for our competition are currently disproportionately focused on some really quite narrow criteria, and those criteria, for a whole variety of cultural reasons, get disproportionately mapped down onto individual researchers. And that results in individual people having to compete very actively on these narrow criteria for very specific outcomes that are their ticket to the next stage in their career. And that is incredibly unhelpful in terms of silo creation, because it makes people conservative and it locks people into these very narrow paths that are very difficult to get out of. So I think that is fundamental to segregating disciplines, also separating research from innovation, another key weakness in our system, and also research and innovation, I would say, from wider society. And breaking down those barriers are absolutely core to why I took the job at UKRI and what I think UKRI should be trying to do. We also need more capability to withstand shocks, to think about how we invest to ensure we're not spreading the money so thinly that everything is clinging on for dear life, and also creating enough flexibility, as we've seen in the pandemic, to be able to pivot if things change. And to me, this means we have to think fundamentally about portfolios of different types of things with a different risk profile that covers the full range of things that we want to do, that can connect things together and build the joined-up system that we need. So we have these 4 principles for change, which reiterate that. Diversity of everything. People, places, the types of ideas, the types of infrastructures, and the right balance of different things is what is going to create the opportunities we have to do the full range of things that the system needs to do. And that diversity is only valuable if it's properly connected. And connectivity is super important and, in my opinion, underinvested in, because it's not a thing. You don't know what you're buying, but unless you pay for connectivity, like the FST, that's what it does, it connects people up, you will not get the connected system, and therefore you won't capture actually the benefits of that diversity. And then we have to think about resilience, for example, in the context of not spreading the money out too thinly. And all of this has to come with very deep engagement, particularly societal engagement, to break down those barriers between the research and innovation system and wider society. And then we have to roll all of that out over the key pillars of what we do. So people and careers, obviously central, places and infrastructures, all kinds of ideas, innovation and the impacts, the problems that we think are crucial, the climate change and infectious disease and all of those kinds of things. And the key technologies we need that underpin all of those activities. And then, of course, UKRI has to also be an organisation that thinks about how we drive through the changes we need across that, those set of objectives. Okay, so as I said, that was a slight diversion, but it was necessary because, to me, it's absolutely crucial to solving these challenges with interdisciplinarity. because getting over this hurdle, the funding and publication quotes barriers, the challenges with assessment and the consequences for career progression, all about supporting diversity with connectivity, supporting and valuing difference and the different contributions that people make to collaborative activity. So diversity with collaboration and connectivity. And so from the point of view of people, we have to support a whole variety of different researchers and innovators. So people with the very traditional research careers, but people who've taken very unusual routes through into research and innovation, particular career paths in academia that we all very straightforwardly recognize, but actually the weaving of people across the private and public sectors into and out of academia, into and out of industry, into and out of policy, all of those kinds of things. And then absolutely we need people who are completely obsessed with a single topic and focus on that relentlessly, but also the people who hop around between disciplines, people who have taken career breaks, people who haven't. All of that difference is actually really important to generating the diverse teams of researchers that we need to tackle some of these problems. At the moment, we are too fixated on particular success measures, and it locks people into rather narrow career paths and prevents the kind of diversity that we need. So one of the things we're doing there started outside this building and then was wonderfully incorporated into this building, which is the so-called resume for researchers. We have expanded that a bit at UKRI. It's now called the Resume for Research and Innovation. And rather than the traditional academic CV, which is the list of papers and the list of grants and the list of fancy prizes, we're doing 4 narrative boxes where you can evidence. Evidence is really important and completely doable in a narrative statement. Your contributions to knowledge, your contributions to supporting other people, be they your students or your colleagues, your contributions to the wider research community. Are you driving through that connectivity that we need, for example, and your engagement with wider stakeholders such as the many publics that are our key stakeholders in all of this. And that captures the full range of things that we want to do. It's not that everybody has to do everything, but everybody can do something in all of those categories. And this standardized format allows people with those very different backgrounds to be compared meaningfully against one another. So a simple, but very doable shift that drives the kind of culture change that I think we need. And then actually expanding out from that, I just want to flag my pet project. Please go and look up 101 Jobs that Change the World, which is the program highlighting the people who are not researchers and innovators, but nonetheless are critical for the system to work. Technicians and administrators and communicators, and it's a fantastic collection of movies. It's not at 101 yet, but if you've got, if you're on the tube and you've got 10 minutes, it's quite fun to scroll through. So people, that's the kind of people interventions, the ideas interventions, as I briefly alluded to at the beginning. You need different ones for these 3 different things, and you have to think about them differently or you're not going to help much. David and I had hoped that we would be past our allocations and it would all be announced and I could be able to tell you all the shiny things we're doing in these different categories, but I can't. So you'll just have to take my word that we're thinking very hard about all the shiny things we could do in these different categories in order to support high quality peer review of disciplinary research with input from another discipline. This speaks very much, for example, to the idea that you don't have to be doing cutting edge maths to solve my maths problem in plant science, but your maths needs to actually add up. So we need someone to referee my proposal that can provide quality assurance on the maths, but whether or not the grant should be funded is about the transformative effect that's going to have on understanding the plant science. Challenge-led stuff, the criteria obviously should be about, are you solving the challenge? And therefore, do these multiple disciplinary inputs contribute to solving the challenge? And that's not the same as, are you pushing forward the frontiers of new knowledge? It's, are you solving the challenge? And then the thing I think is the sort of real dark matter in all of this is I don't think we even know enough about the stuff that's not even, where at UKRI, we never even see the proposals because people have no idea where to send them. And I'm very interested in trying to surface those proposals. If you gave someone the opportunity to apply for absolutely anything, what would they apply for? And what would it look like as a project? Given that they have nowhere to send it now. We don't want them just to send the proposals they could have sent anywhere already, but I'm really interested in that, and it will take a little while to explore that idea with the communities, but I'm quite excited about that as a possibility. So what that really all loops back to is, along with all the different kinds of people, we need to be thinking explicitly about the fact that we're funding different kinds of projects, and the criteria for assessing those different kinds of projects will be different, and that doesn't mean you can't assess them all in the same funding round, for example. You absolutely can, and you can tension them against one another because you're building a portfolio of different types of things. That's where you're going to get your overall quality in the system from. And it should be possible to have a kind of menu, I think, of criteria, and for applicants to say which they think the most important criteria are for their proposal, to guide the peer review panels in how they rank that proposal and rate that proposal in that portfolio kind of way. And I think that's critical, and that the pushback criticism you get from that is, oh, but surely we should just be funding excellence. That should be the only criterion. Nobody knows what excellence is, let's face it. They think they do, but they don't. You can define it broad ways. I'm all in favour of excellence, but I'm in favour of different sorts of excellence. And the notion that, you know, supposing I had 100 grants to referee, and 3 of them happened to be identical, and that happened to be the best one out of the 100. If I'm only funding best on that kind of same criteria of best, I have to fund that same grant 3 times. That's what I'm telling myself through my excellence only rule. Diversity across what you're funding is important, and that means you need to have ways to tension different kinds of proposals against one another, and I think that's completely doable with a well-trained, high-quality peer review system, which I think we need to think about delivering. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Otlin. That's a great way of starting the discussion. People will already be thinking of questions and comments, and we are on Slido this evening. It's not the Zoom Q&A function, it is Slido, which of course you can access. It's sly.do, and the code for this event is 670645. And of course, all of our online participants are very welcome. And equally, if people here in the room, you can either raise your hands, but equally, especially if you want to upvote and things, use your mobile phones, go onto Slido and see how the Q&A is developing. So now we turn to our second speaker, Professor Rachel Guberman-Hill. She is Director of the Elizabeth Blackwell Institute for Health Research and Professor of Health and Anthropology at the University of Bristol, an institute that nurtures interdisciplinary research. She herself is, by disciplinary background, a social anthropologist, which means she's well equipped to understand Britain's science community and how it works. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your wise comments.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for the invitation to be here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here because I've worked in interdisciplinary contexts for well over 20 years. And so everything that I talk about for the next 10 or 12 minutes is going to be based on the experiences that I've gained from working with a whole raft of absolutely brilliant people from a whole range of different disciplines. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about what interdisciplinarity means to me. I'm not going to dwell on definitions, but I'm just going to say a little bit about how I think about it. I'm then going to talk about interdisciplinarity in practice and some of the projects that I've been deeply involved in delivering and also supporting. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about some of the challenges in doing interdisciplinarity and in supporting work that tries to be interdisciplinary in its nature. I'm very relaxed about definitions. I know that many people get quite concerned when they are trying to define whether their work is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or transdisciplinary. And I always suggest to people, don't worry, just do what's best. I also think it's incredibly important that when we talk about terminology for the kind of integration that we would try to achieve through bringing disciplines together, we don't place them on a hierarchy of value or virtue. There's nothing intrinsically better about transdisciplinarity compared with interdisciplinarity, and there's nothing intrinsically better about interdisciplinarity when compared with multidisciplinarity. To me, that's very, very important as a starting point. Interdisciplinary ways of working and doing research, including in a university context where I come from, has been around for a very long time indeed. And I think it's important to also start by thinking about what disciplines are and what they offer to us and how they work. I tend to think of disciplines as shaped by historical, social, and economic forces, but I would because I've got a background in anthropology. Disciplines shape the way that we think about the things we study, they shape how we seek to know the things that we study, and they also shape the ways in which we do study the things that we wish to study. Disciplines have fuzzy boundaries or firm boundaries. Disciplines develop over time. But very importantly, researchers often identify themselves through their discipline. So people might say, I am a sociologist, I am an economist, I am a statistician. Okay, I'm none of those things. But people feel very closely associated with their disciplines, and it becomes part of who they are and their identity as a person. So people who span disciplines and work in between disciplines need to feel equally valued and equally able to benefit from the work that they do to bring disciplines together and to work in an interdisciplinary way. And I think that's very, very important when we're thinking about career progression of people who work across disciplines. So I think that to boost researchers' confidence and sense of value in the work that they do, it's really useful to think about what interdisciplinarity is good for, what it does, what benefit it provides. There are many reasons, I think, to do interdisciplinary work. We can use interdisciplinarity, as Ottolin's already said, to address challenges. And a lot of the work that I do has been challenge-led in nature. We can also use interdisciplinarity to address questions that frankly couldn't be answered fully otherwise if we didn't use an interdisciplinary approach. But there's also real benefit to individuals and their careers and their ways of working through working across disciplines. And I think it's very important that we consider that as part of the benefit of doing work that crosses disciplines and brings them together. There's also, I think, a third benefit to interdisciplinarity. There's many others as well, but there's a third one I want to highlight today, and that's in relation to the research system and the way in which we do research more generally. So when we work across disciplines and we have conversations with each other, we can move things forwards in relation to how we do research, how we share data, how we make our information open to members of the public, and how we ensure that people are providing their full informed consent to take part in research. So all of those things can be improved and enhanced by working together across disciplines. But I want to bring all of that to life, and I want to do that by talking about some research that I've been quite deeply involved in. And the first thing I want to talk about is a project that I led that was focused on pain. And this was a project that was called the STAR programme. It was funded by the National Institute for Health Research, and it's just recently completed its work. The work focused on long-term pain after knee replacement, and that might sound a bit niche, but actually it's an enormous problem because around 100,000 operations each year happen in the UK to replace someone's knee. But about 15 to 20% of people who have that kind of operation have long-term pain afterwards. You can imagine that's enormously disappointing for them. The reason they've had the surgery in the first place is to relieve their pain, and they find they have pain afterwards. So we convened a team. The team comprised experts from a number of disciplines. I shan't name them here because I'll probably leave some of the disciplines out by accident. But what we did was address the challenge of long-term pain after knee replacement by designing a multifaceted programme of work that included work to develop a care pathway for use in healthcare, worked to understand why some people with pain didn't put themselves forward for treatment, and worked to understand how and when people recovered or didn't recover after their surgery. I asked the team what they felt helped to deliver the programme as a whole. First of all, they said they were really pleased that the programme was going to make a difference to people. They felt that the purpose had been met. We developed a care pathway which is now being rolled out in some colleagues' NHS hospitals, and we're going to look at the implementation and see how that goes. So there's a real sense that common goal, the common goal of doing something that would help people with pain had been met. That was very important. The second thing that people told me really mattered to them working in the context of the programme was working together with enough time to enable them to have the conversations in which they could listen to one another. So we held workshops, we held meetings, we created safe, encouraging space for people to ask questions of one another. But that sounds very, very soft and very broad. But what we did in those workshops is we gave people specific tasks to work on, and people were fantastic at bringing their own tasks to the workshops and deciding what should be done and what should be improved in conversation with each other. The other thing that people said when I asked them what worked in this programme of work was that they said what really worked was the absence of big egos. I quote. I read that in a number of ways. I read that in terms of respect. I'm very aware that there was a great degree of respect between members of the team and the different disciplinary perspectives that they brought. I also read that as kind of a behaviour rather than a trait. And people really enacted the respect for each other and the expertise that they brought, and were very able to say when they didn't know something, just as much as when they did know something. And that created a culture of openness in the way in which everybody worked together. Overall, we also, I think, all grew together as a team. We learnt about some of the progressive things that have been happening in research over the last 6 to 8 years, and they include attention to data sharing and attention to pre-submission of protocols for research. So disciplines are in very different spaces in relation to those things, but we're on a really great forward trajectory in research in relation to how we think about them and we think about the value of making our data available. So by the end of the programme, we'd positioned ourselves in a place where we had appropriate consent in place from participants, and we had a lot of participants in the research, and we were able to make the information publicly available, and we will be doing that shortly, with appropriate attention to the necessary checks and balances. Okay, so as a team, we've moved forward and really thought about how we do the research. That's just one brief example. I'd like to move on now and talk about some of the work I've done to support the research of other folks, and that support that I've provided through my role at the Elizabeth Blackwell Institute at Bristol. The Elizabeth Blackwell Institute is supported with funding from the Wellcome Trust through their Institutional Strategic Support Funding Scheme, and we receive that with gratitude, and we work very hard to curate that very carefully. We run initiatives from the Institute which explicitly seek to support interdisciplinary research development, and they include focus on mental health, climate change and health, global public health, to name but a few. Again, always risky to do a list because I've missed lots out. The mechanisms that we use for doing this support are kind of multifaceted, but one of the key things that we think works is using the existing structures within the university to bring people together. So we ask colleagues in the university to submit proposals to us that cross faculties, that comprise people from at least 2 of our 6 faculties and ideally more. And our faculties at the University of Bristol already do interdisciplinary research within them, but this just adds an additional mechanism to bring people and disciplines together. One of the projects that I thought I'd mention today that we supported through this initiative was a piece of work that was funded by UKRI eventually, once we'd put our support in internally, and it was led by Professor Ian Craddock. This was a project that was funded within the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and it was a piece of work to develop passive monitoring technology to put into people's homes, and the monitoring technology was to focus on health behaviours. Speaking from my own experience of that collaboration, what I saw were really clear benefits to working across disciplines. Again, many disciplines were involved. It was largely an engineering project, as you can hear from what I've said about it, but also involved were experts in public engagement, bioethicists, social scientists, to name a few. The system was developed brilliantly, and it was deployed into hundreds of people's homes across our region. I don't think that work could have been done if it wasn't for the fact that we had various disciplines feeding in. So this project was an example of a project in which we had an engineering project that needed the feed-in from the ethicists to talk with us about privacy, had feed-in from the public engagement experts to talk with us about how to ensure the system was appropriate and acceptable. And that worked. There was also some real learning across the whole programme in terms of how we addressed ethics and consent and dealt with the governance processes that we needed to work on. So I hope that's given you a sense of how I've done interdisciplinarity and the benefit that I think it's brought to the research that we do. I find it exhilarating and rewarding to work in this way, but there are, of course, quite a few challenges along the way. Everyone who talks about interdisciplinarity always talks about the time it takes and the energy needed to deliver it well. And I think that's very important. And I think we can think of that in a variety of ways. My colleagues talk to me about workshops and needing time and needing very specific tasks to do. But people are busy, so I asked people what would help, and people said to me, actually what would really help at the beginning of all projects is an infographic showing who does what and what they can benefit from. So I think I'll take that away for the future. There's also a challenge of deciding when not to foster interdisciplinarity and when it's not appropriate. And in our institute, we supported a lot of research in March 2020 focused on the COVID response and research to address the pandemic that started at that time. The research that we supported wasn't explicitly interdisciplinary, but we worked very quickly to get research off the ground quickly, and some of it then naturally became interdisciplinary in order to address the challenge-led questions that they were looking at. I'll finish by saying that the comment from a colleague about the absence of big egos is really important because it's a signal about the importance of openness, the value of diverse disciplines, and enabling a sense of equal contribution in research. This can be put into action in a number of ways, including authorship, governance processes, and lots of open discussions about what we do. I think it's really important that people who work in an interdisciplinary way are valued for that skill in itself. And I think we need to think about time, respect, the benefits of interdisciplinarity, and to embrace everything it has to offer. So thank you very much indeed, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. Now our third speaker is Professor Graham Reid. He is Professor of Science and Research Policy at University College London, and he also chairs the board of the National Physical Laboratory. He has spent most of his career in the interface between science and government, working in the Cabinet Office, in the Treasury, and in the business department. I think perhaps our paths crossed then. And now he's, has, of course, most recently given, with Sir Adrian Smith, President here of the Royal Society, important advice on Brexit and science funding post-Brexit, which is a story for another day. Graham, over to you.
David, thank you very much for that introduction. I support such a lot of what Rachel and Ottoline have said that I can see a risk that your speakers are going to agree with one another. So I thought I should mitigate that risk by saying a few words in defense of disciplines. To me, disciplines are a really key part of they're cornerstones of the research ecosystem. Apart from anything else, disciplines provide a sense of identity that I think Rachel mentioned, but they also provide a framework for professional training. They allow professionals to be trained for careers in an environment that is rich in research, where professional training and the discovery of new knowledge coexist in the environment. Whether you are training to become an engineer, a lawyer, a veterinary surgeon, a doctor, you can keep on going. That coexistence of knowledge discovery and professional training, to me, is one of the key functions of disciplines. When hiring people, I have a great deal of interest in their disciplinary background. And without strong disciplines, I won't be able to get the people with the level of confidence that I'd like. Now, collaborating across disciplines can be difficult. There are often different values, there's different types of professional expertise, there are different sources of funding, and there are different expectations, so that forming teams that cross disciplines comes with a sort of administrative overhead. But actually, that overhead, that clunkiness, that is a creative process. That is the process of allowing people with different professional backgrounds to view a research challenge from different perspectives. And the sweet spot is not seeing that just as an extra cost overhead, but as a creative activity that helps define the research challenge in a more creative way, and indeed pursue the research challenge in a more creative way. In my time at the National Physical Laboratory, I see regularly the interface between law and physics as people try to find ways of adopting very high precision physical measurements into standards and regulation. And that interplay between the two ways of viewing the world is an immensely creative part of the process. So the title of this evening's discussion is about how to increase interdisciplinary R&D. So I thought I'd have a go at that under three headings. First of all, have a look at funding structures, then think about institutional structures, and then think about career structures. So first of all, funding. It's really easy to assume that all the problems lie on the funder's desk, and if only the funder would behave properly, in that case all would be okay. I just don't buy it. I think that funders can make life difficult, but I don't think that funders can make everything okay. First of all, actually, there are many funders that support interdisciplinary research and have done for many decades. There are charitable institutions like the Leverhulme and Wellcome that have really, I can't actually remember them not doing interdisciplinary research. Quite a lot of my work at UCL is supported one way or another by government or parliament. They don't really do disciplines. They do policy problems. And you just have to find the combination of disciplines that are needed to address the problem. UKRI, as Ottoline has said, actually has quite a long history in interdisciplinary work, but is giving it a profile and giving it a depth of analysis that I think is going to serve us well in the future. Even although I don't think that Ottoline can actually solve all the problems in every bit of the research community. Even Ottoline can't do that. Institutional structures. I was returning, as I often do, to Lord Willett's excellent book, A University Education. I read, not for the first time, the text that says Britain's lack of serious, well-funded public research institutes outside universities may be a crucial weakness in promoting interdisciplinary research. And not for the first time, I found myself disagreeing with Lord Willits in that one sentence. The rest of the book I love. And I disagree with it because of the emphasis on universities. And I think universities are actually a wonderful place to create interdisciplinary research institutes. They have the enormous advantage of already containing a diverse population of disciplinary expertise. They can adopt an enormous variety of governance models for the institute structure, and then they have the agility to be able to unwind an institute and create a new one without having to fire the whole workforce because they're a standalone employer. So my instinct is that while I don't say that universities can solve every problem of interdisciplinary research, nor do I think the problem automatically lies in standalone institutes. I think that the institutional distinctions can be overplayed. I think what matters is the willingness to be agile, flexible, and adventurous, rather than whether or not your starting point is inside or outside a university. Finally, career structures. I said at the beginning that I'm actually a real fan of disciplinary structures as a place to train and acquire some accredited, well-structured expertise in a professional domain. But they can become career traps. And that, I think, is deeply unfortunate. And I say that as someone who's never been able to stick to a discipline, maybe because of my attention span, I don't know. I think that one of the things that would help here would be the identification and promotion of role models to show that while pursuing a career within a discipline can be a wonderful and rewarding process, pursuing a career that is as a discipline hopper or as an interdisciplinary researcher can be every bit as rewarding. And the thing is that we do have some wonderful role models available. I always think of a former president of the Royal Society, Lord May, the late Lord May, who I kind of lost track of how many careers he had as a researcher operating in different disciplines. I mean, he was a sort of zoologist come mathematician come, other things. He kept on reinventing himself. That's one model, but it's not the only model. There are so many different types of role model that operate across disciplinary boundaries in different ways. And I think that if we found ways to celebrate them and frankly advertise them, that would help. So, in summary, don't assume the answer always lies in the funding bodies. I think that institutional structures are important, but not always in the way we think. And in particular, I don't think that there's a sort of institutes good, universities bad type of categorization. And in terms of careers, as with so many other things in career development, a good role model goes a long way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Graham. Our final speaker is Professor David Soskis. He has been the Professor of Political Science and Economics at the LSE since 2012. Before that, he served as a professor at Oxford University and also professor at the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin, when I think it was during that time that he produced his great book, Varieties of Capitalism, which is a really important contribution to our understanding of institutions and comparative advantage. But Professor Soskis also led the British Academy Working Party on interdisciplinary research, which produced a really important and deep report on this issue back in 2016. So we're very grateful to Professor Soskis for joining us this evening. Over to you.
Well, I've had a real bad luck of talking after Graham, but great pleasure in just having 5 minutes of you two. Anyway, what I want to talk about was this. We've been working a lot on innovation in service sector innovation in the States and also in Baden-Württemberg, and looking at the skill sets which are a really important part of how that innovation takes place. There's now a lot of evidence about the fact that it's associated with relatively small graduate-intensive workplaces, flat corporations, limited management, and relational decision-making. And that then has a lot of implications for the type of skills people need to have and to take out of university with them. And I wanted really to focus on the way in which disciplines work in universities or don't work in universities to produce the necessary type of skills. As I see it, there are 4 major interacting skill sets which go together in an effective graduate-intensive workplace, which is working out some innovation. These are largely service sector innovations, and needless to say, almost wholly software-based innovations nowadays. The first type of skills are management skills, and we unfortunately don't teach management skills very much in British universities, to a small extent, but in American universities and increasingly in German universities, particularly in places like Baden-Württemberg, management is one of the absolutely key skills which people learn. I'll come back to it in a minute. The second type of skills is software engineering, which, as it were, goes without saying. The third set of skills, which is talked about more and more nowadays, is our social and, if I can put it this way, psychological, empathetic skills, which become a more and more key part of the way in which groups of people doing innovation, building innovative products, absolutely have to have. And the fourth type of skills are creativity and imagination. Now, had I said instead, well, we need to have political science, good political scientist, you need to, let's say, no physics, and mathematics as well, sorry, I forgot about that. Those would be the sort of things which we've been used to thinking of in terms of the skills which you have to develop at university and which companies are going to want you to have when they bring you in to do innovative type of work. It's very interesting that both in both in Baden-Württemberg, which of course operates a totally different way to, let's say New York or somewhere like that, as far as the way in which innovative collaborations work. The type of skills I've been talking about are things which are produced by the educational system, but above all by the way in which universities, both places, have changed a lot to produce the type of skills which I was talking about. Germany's gone over to a system of as it were, the ordinary universities, but also universities which are called Fachhochschulen or institutes, universities of applied science. And universities of applied science, which have really built up in Baden-Württemberg over the past 20 years, very closely related, needless to say, to the big research companies. These train people primarily, they focus on IT, software engineering, and management, but they pay a great deal of attention to people working together and developing social skills by working together. And then picking out and being able to really reward those people who've got creativity and imagination. That's even more true in the States nowadays. Quite a lot of our work has been just exactly seeing how, in the way in which really good managers work, they pick out and can very quickly reward and promote people who they can see have got creativity and imagination and can work together with other people. Now, I now look at the LSE. God, am I going to insult anybody here? I hope not. So I taught a large time of my career in Oxford. Oxford actually has, there is actually beneath everything, learning how to deal with tutors, learning their idiosyncrasies, putting things together. That is actually, but this was a very, very long time ago, and Oxford has, alas, changed quite a lot. But if I think about how would one develop a university like the LSE so that we actually are producing people with these sorts of skills, then I think we have to think in very different ways. We can actually, we can mimic quite a lot of what goes on, particularly in the States. I mean, in the States, a lot of this takes place actually in professional schools. So professional schools in the States are, business schools in the States are really different to business schools here. You have lots and lots of group work where you have projects, people working together, doing things, developing just the sorts of skills which they will find they will need. Is it possible to imagine this in the UK? Is it possible to imagine that in a third undergraduate year, half the year consists of people working together as a group with a project which they have to actually, solve. This is actually what Finnish children do between the ages of 6 and 9. They're told, here's what, you've got to build this shack. And just, we'll give you a few clues. This then provides this whole environment of people learning how to work together and think, and how do you choose leaders or not, and so on. Now, I'm not proposing that we start building shacks in the middle of Lincoln's Inn Fields or something like that. Quite a nice thing to do. But I do think the idea that you train people by getting them to work together, as it were, autonomously, and then being able to pick out and train people on that basis is the sort of way forward which we should be we should be thinking about there. So I've just become emeritus. I feel now I can say just what I want about the LSE. Marvellous place though it is. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Take your seat at the far end. Great. Good. Thank you very much to our 4 speakers. We've already got lots of questions coming in on Slido, and I'm going to go straight to the one that has been most widely supported, that's got the most votes. And this is really for Otlin, though others may want to comment as well. What is UKRI doing that is innovative in implementing more interdisciplinary work across disciplines? And then there's a sting in the tail. This is, I'm sure, why it's been upvoted to top. And what is it that has not been done by EU framework programmes? So we've even got a comparison as to how our domestic national interdisciplinary agenda compares with what was possible from Europe. Otlin, you first on that one.
Gosh, well, I think I kind of, as I mentioned, there are the 3 types of interdisciplinarity that I think we need to think differently about how we support. The stuff that's anchored in disciplines, I think we actually have a very rich history of doing exactly that. And there are a lot of examples of grants and programs and things that we funded in councils, driven by, for example, some of the ones that Rachel mentioned, and also concerted efforts to build interdisciplinary communities at particular interfaces between councils. That I think, has worked reasonably well for a long time. Challenge of funding has risen up the agenda, and I think is something that also the creation of UKRI has very much helped to foster, particularly in the context of things like the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. There are lots of examples of those programs, which I think we have also done reasonably well. And then I think the under-considered thing is that area of, you know, what grants do we never see? And I think beyond that, there are all of these questions that have come out of all the talks, really, about the culture of our research, what we value, what we reward, how we train people in different contexts, doctoral training centres that are inherently interdisciplinary, for example, where people might well be working in teams, multiple students on one. I mean, there's a whole range of different things one can think about in all of these contexts. And so I think it's always good to continue to innovate, but I do think that the history of the research councils that predated UKRI and now UKRI is one of innovative thinking across that landscape, and we continue to do that. What do we do that I mean, obviously the European programs also have a reasonable history from that point of view. I would say my experience of them involves the European Research Council funded programs, which are very single investigator driven inherently. And although those single investigators might be interdisciplinary, actually they're quite anchored in the rather traditional way of thinking about research, and the criteria that they use are all about cutting edge excellence, but they're not particularly innovative, frankly, in my opinion. They're fabulous, don't get me wrong, but yes. And that's a big chunk of the European spend. And then the much broader programs, which are more team or at least collaborative oriented, where the programs bringing together multiple groups from different countries. I think a huge benefit you get is that inherent internationality of the teams, where you have people who've trained in different traditions and bring together their different ideas in different ways. I think that's fantastic. And that's harder to do as just one country, obviously. But I don't think there's anything from a kind of theoretical consideration of promoting interdisciplinarity that the European programs do that you can't point to something that's already in the UK that we're not going to lose some mechanism for interdisciplinarity through if we can't participate. We will lose that easy opportunity to build those collaborative programs across Europe, and that's something I would be very concerned about trying to replace if we possibly can.
Well, let's go straight to Graham, actually, because this does overlap with what you were saying this evening and your work on alternative funding models. Will these alternative funding models, would they do better or worse or interdisciplinarity, do you think, Graham?
First of all, Adrian Smith and I recommended that the UK should make no attempt at all to mimic EU programme funding, because you can't have a domestic mimic of a 28-country collaboration. Instead, we recommended that there should be funding that was optimised around UK interests rather than compromised around 28 countries. The sorts of things that, if I can kind of answer a bit of the question that was posed to Ottoline, the sort of things I see UKRI doing that are difficult to do through EU channels would include the network of catapult centres supported by Innovate UK and others that are aligned to specific industry sectors and clusters, various research council facilities and institutes ranging from the British Antarctic Survey to the Diamond Light Source, and then other specific funding streams that all have long, complicated names, but aren't actually aligned at all to disciplines, but are aligned to regional clusters or something else.
Right. Rachel, your observations?
I think the internationality angle is really important, and I'd encourage us to think beyond Europe and beyond the UK, and to think about what might work particularly working with partners in low and middle income contexts, and how we can put in place ways to achieve equitable partnerships in those contexts, which could be either driven by colleagues and members of communities in those countries or colleagues here. I think that's part of the picture, and I think it's important because I think disciplines can be understood in different ways, in different contexts, and I think the value of interdisciplinarity can manifest itself in different ways in different contexts.
Thank you. I'm going to add an extra angle and then turn to Professor Soskis, if I may, because I want to take this a bit further in terms of the role of universities, which Graham touched on, and in a way part of the background to Nurse 2. Nurse 1 was about UKRI and interdisciplinary funding. Nurse 2 is partly about whether you need a more diverse network of institutions, including establishments outside universities, and part of the thinking may be that that is a better environment for interdisciplinarity. And of course, in Germany, you referred to the sort of Technische Hochschulen, the universities of applied science. Are the classic German universities good at interdisciplinarity, or is that a challenge for them?
Yeah. Yes. I think that if we just talk about Germany for a moment, one of the most interesting developments has been the close relationships between the very big companies and the universities, not actually the proper echt universities, but the University of Applied Science, which aren't the same as the Technische Hochschule are the very high-level engineering universities and so on. The University of Applied Science, the Fachhochschule, there are about 20 or 30 of them now in Baden-Württemberg, same number in Bavaria. They operate closely to a small city and very closely to the actual companies in that city, and that sort of relationship is very important. There's been a development of that in Germany, which is, I think, extremely important in many ways, called the dual studium system, where, let's say, Daimler actually works out a dual degree with with actually one of the Fachhochschulers in Stuttgart, and plays a very active role in getting students to engage to engage in actually designing things, for designing institutions and so on for Daimler. It's been very successful as a way of doing things.
Right. Now I'm going to just ensure that the people who are physically present, and so now you may not all be voting on Slido as well, have an opportunity to put a question. So if right, we have several hands up, and then I'm going to go back to. Let me collect several. I'm going to collect several interventions in one go. I think we got. Let's start at the. Okay, yes, your microphone is there. Then we'll move down to the front. We're going to get several questions in, and if you give your name and organisation.
Jim Lynch, University of Surrey. I very much welcome the story of the interdisciplinarity, and what I also is pleased that you touched on the balance between natural and physical sciences and the social sciences. That's important. But I think there's another dimension that perhaps wasn't considered if we're going to make things really work. There's another thing that we don't really recognise as discipline, and that's finance. Now, I give this as a particular illustration. If we look at the whole concept, climate change, and carbon trading, we need to engage with the financial institutions. This is what we often don't do. And I think this is where there's potentially a massive opportunity, because with the advent of AI and machine learning, I think the engagement with the financial sector and some really high-level people that could help us, that's what could really make the difference.
Right, a pitch for finance. I'm going to keep on moving forward. There are two people in that row. Yes? Yes, the gentleman there, then the lady. Yeah.
Thank you, John Wood. Among other things, I'm a consultant to Idea Square, which is based at CERN, which is about challenge-based learning, mainly with master's degree students. But one thing that becomes very clear is that there has to be a coordinator of projects. And I come from, I think Graham remembers, the big international science infrastructures. And I remember a professor at Cape Town University connected with the SKA saying, I've just committed academic suicide to coordinate this project. And I think one of the key things is, how do you reward the people who coordinate? It's a little bit of what you were saying, but when you get to, in my case, 50, and I gave up my subject to coordinate interdisciplinary programs, and it was very difficult to go back.
Right. Then, alongside you, yes?
Hello, I'm Anushka Dave, and I work for Technopolis, and we've studied what works for interdisciplinary research across many countries. And 2 points that Ottoline raised really chimed with what we've seen, the supporting of connectivity and engagement. My question is, often this needs to happen outside funding cycles. You need to build teams and have before you put in a proposal. And often the engagement with wider stakeholders is required for impact, but needs to happen after the funding has completed. So what do you suggest would be the ways to manage that?
Thank you very much. I'm going to keep on going. Yes, gentlemen here, and then we'll go to the front. Yeah.
Thank you, Lord Willett. Andy Sellers from the Compound Semiconductor Applications Catapult. I'm not going to ask a question about compound semiconductors. I've got a slightly left field question, actually. So reflecting on Professor Guberman-Hill's presentation, long-term pain after knee replacement, I wondered what the panel's view was about working with non-conventional research groups, for example, yoga organizations. Wow. So these are people that don't naturally have an academic home. And I noticed that yoga was actually on the front cover of the New Scientist. So I'd be interested in the panel's views. Thank you.
Very interesting question. And then I think in the front row, yes?
Thank you. Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. We did a report last year that identified REF as a significant barrier to interdisciplinary research. So I'd be interested to hear the panel's view on what's the role of assessment in universities, and how do we make sure we reward interdisciplinary research?
Right. Now, we've had 5 interventions. We don't need, all the panelists don't need to comment on all interventions. You've now got the luxury of selecting the question or comment you're most interested in. Graham, starting here, we'll work along.
Well, actually, I'm going to pick up the non-conventional research groups because I see that that is, on the one hand, a big opportunity, but I don't minimise the challenge. I think it is an opportunity because, as Ottoline said, and Ottoline, I'm not going to try and steal your thunder because you're more eloquent than me on this, but I think that there is an opportunity to bring fresh perspectives and disruptive thinking and bring in people who are not trying to prepare for the next ref and aren't constrained in that way. On the other hand, I think that we have to recognise that some non-conventional groups may come with an agenda that is less than dispassionate, and they may not all have the rigour that will be required to fit into a professional research team.
Right. But so delicately. Rachel.
If I can have the privilege of just continuing on.
With that. Yeah.
Thank you. So I've done some work over the years with groups that might be considered to be non-conventional. I've always found it incredibly rewarding because I think it's often creative and it often expands our knowledge and expands the way that we think about the world that we're inhabiting. I think, though, that often has to be framed in discussions about what the evidence base needs to look like in order to affect change. And so I've had some really fantastic conversations about how we work with non-conventional research groups and do some work that brings that work into alignment with the evidence-based mechanisms that we have within research and science that would enable any findings to make a change if we demonstrated benefit.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank Ottlin. Now, there are several that are quite sort of UKRI aimed there about the REF, the challenge of the REF, very topical. Coordinators and their careers. Your observation?
Yes, maybe I'll try and roll some of these things together. So I do think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that the way in which we assess both research and researchers has become increasingly narrow and constrained, quite often I think through the very good motive of trying to be kind of quote subjective. So you wind up writing down a very narrow set of criteria that everybody then has to meet, and then everybody's surprised that what you get out at the other end is a rather narrow set of outputs. And so we do need to find ways to broaden the assessment criteria we use. That definitely does not involve dumbing down. It involves thinking harder about what we need and the benefits that many people have talked about from the questions from the panel of difference. So different people coming in from different disciplines that are not even anchored in our kind of standard research base. We've heard about these, kind of epistemologically kind of outside groups. Some of the practice-based activities like finance, I would put into that category. So how do we create a much more dynamic system where people come in and out? And how do we build a funding infrastructure that supports that upstream and downstream engagement that you need? And I would argue that things like the resume for researchers and innovation, allow one to create ways for people to present their skills and all the rest of this. Links back to the types of skills that you are highlighting that are so important, that are pan-disciplinary, and people need to develop and acquire and be able to evidence in that kind of CV. And so I would say, that yes, coordinating is absolutely critical activity, and it fits very squarely in the context of that CV. So that all of the things that people worry about, oh no, I can't do this because, most of the because is completely movable, and we as a community have the power to move it. And one of the things I found most surprising working in research and innovation is the extent to which people feel straitjacketed by a system that they themselves have created. And we need to be more confident in our ability to break those boundaries and welcome in people with different ideas in that much more positive way. Very nitty-gritty on the ref. A lot of consideration has gone in over the years to try to improve the considerations of interdisciplinarity. I think it can go further, but nonetheless, the general view is that this time round, the overarching assessment of interdisciplinarity, where, for example, Athene Donald had very much a leading role, has gone a lot better. There are still things to learn and we can improve, but the general view is that it was well considered and rewarded, even in the context of a very disciplinarily kind of chunked system. So there are solutions to these problems, and if we're good at research and innovation, we should be able to find them.
David, your comments, and do you want to pick up that, especially those last observations, because of course that report that you chaired for the British Academy, identifying the barriers to interdisciplinarity, didn't focus so much, if I remember correctly, on the funding. It was more things like the structure of the ref, the structure of academic disciplines, the shape of publications. How do you see the weight of those sort of factors?
Well, I pay a lot of attention. Could I just say, I thought there were such interesting questions, actually, a whole group of them.
Yeah.
But I can't resist on picking up on the finance question, simply because it is, first of all, there is so much research which somehow needs to be done integrating finance and how finance works with a whole series of other things. And one of the problems about finance, which I have found, has been to what extent people who work on finance academically work in a quite narrow way, even more than other disciplines which could be mentioned. I'm just sort of slightly hoping that Richard is going to. I'm looking at you, Richard, just hoping a slight smile is going to come over onto your face. So I think trying to work out how you bring finance into sort of more general research, I think it's absolutely essential, but I think it's a very, very difficult thing to do.
Right, thank you. I'm now going to select some more from Slido, and then I'll come back to the room here. But on slide, and I'll start this time with David and work the other way. But actually, I think because it has been voted the most popular question, so though it's not directly related to what we're talking about today, I should put on the agenda the question: how can the UK remain an international partner of choice in the light of this year's £120 million ODA budget cuts? So there's clearly strong feeling on that out in the community, and it has been upvoted. But I'm going to move on to some other questions that more directly flow from the subject tonight. There's a couple that are around just the sheer difference between individuals who have experience in academia, in industry, in policy, that difficulty of having multidimensional careers for people who wish to combine those sorts of experiences, or for people who come from within those specific frameworks. They speak different languages. How can we bridge the gap between them? So that's not so much conventional academic disciplines linking up. It's different types of experiences. And that in turn links to another question about diversity, which is about ethnic diversity as one example. Of the 575 chemistry professors in the UK, just one is black. How can we increase diverse thinking if the mechanisms we're operating are not inclusive? So, question about ODA, and then going on to questions about people with different shaped careers and diversity in all its forms, including ethnic diversity. David.
Well, I think diversity in general just comes absolutely bang into all the work which we're doing on the way in which software, setting up small software companies, the role of diversity, but the role of diversity, I mean, I think I needed to say I've been quite involved in this, and I'm I'm amazed how difficult it. But I taught in Duke for quite a long time. Duke has built up ethnic diversity very effectively over quite a sort of period of 10 years or so. I'm really intrigued as to why it's relatively difficult to do in this country, though LSE is not done badly. But I'm really much more interested in how do you put together people with different sorts of views about life. I mean, this is the sort of stuff which works really well in big lively cities, buzzy cities in the terminology, where you get people who are interested in all sorts of things. You put them together, and that's really important thing to be able to do. Whether I mean, if I was to go on, I'd say I think there are huge difficulties because you get people with different. If you're really interested in diversity, you get people with radically different political views, and that I think is not something you want. Actually, I don't think because I think that sort of diversity actually stymies people thinking through things in a different way. But I don't include you in that, needless to say.
Thank you. Last minute reprieve. Otterlyn.
Yes, I can speak to both of those things. Particularly in the context of a discussion about interdisciplinarity, as I highlighted in my talk, fundamentally a lot of this is about creating spaces where difference is enthusiastically welcomed. And so if you have a disagreement, that's an interesting thing. Yes. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. And that environment actually has got to be broadly core to research and innovation in general, particularly interdisciplinarity, but even deeply anchored in disciplines. Something you don't understand should absolutely draw you in. And we have nonetheless somehow managed to create environments in research and innovation where that's not the case, where conforming, stacking up your brownie points in this, that, or the other, ego is critical, and we need ways to value difference. And again, it's that thinking really hard about what excellence is, and that means different people contributing different things. So it's not everybody doing the same. It's excellence created from the diversity of different people in an environment, and that is challenging because it is scary. Disagreement is also inherently scary. So building those kinds of research environments where it isn't is a key challenge, and this gets back actually to a lot of those core skills that you were highlighting. And listening to people is really important. So having that empathy, being able to sort of dig into a disagreement and understand it rather than and recognize it rather than pull away from it, and that is about creativity and imagination. Yes. So all of those things are crucial, and there's lots of work on how you can solve problems better in groups where at least one person is empathetic and those creativity skills. Yes. And that, I think, is actually critical to solving some of the really profound inequalities we have in our system, and we need to work on that, and which is why I'm so keen on things like this multi-part CV and on having assessment criteria that value difference rather than try to crush it. Quick on ODA cuts, it was hugely painful and very traumatic for the people who spent so long building up those fantastic collaborations internationally. And for the teams in UKRI, I've got to say, who have worked so hard to support those, then having to work hard to dismantle them was just horrible. And so we definitely don't want to do that again. It comes about from the rules around the definition of official development assistance. And if we go, as our contribution to ODA works its way back up to the percentage that it should be, and if we wind up building that back into these research and innovation partnerships, which is an excellent use of that money, we have got to do it in a way that doesn't make it sensitive to those kinds of rapid cuts again. we have to have a way to backfill the money if the budget goes down, because trust is so important in those relationships, and we can't compromise that even further than it's already been compromised.
Yes, very true. And incidentally, for this question, because it has been upvoted a lot, of course, only this week we have had the government publish its development strategy, which is the sort of beginning of the Foreign Office planning the revival as we head back to 0.7%, and that has got quite a significant role for science and research partnerships within that, but that is not in any way to we've all to recognise the pain of the last couple of years. Rachel, your comments.
So first of all, I'd agree with everything that's been said, and then to bring together the question of diversity with a question in the room about reward for research coordination, I think. There's evidence that diverse teams perform better than teams that are not diverse. So I'd like to think that the research system is on a really clear journey to put in place measures to help support diversity in our research base. I think one of the things that we need to get right is reward and recognition for careers of all types in the research system. And there's a huge amount of work already ongoing. You've heard from Ottoline about the resume for research and innovation. That's a really important step for the system as a whole. We need, though, to make sure that everyone in the system, whether they're in a coordination role, a management role, a technical role, or an academic research role, is adequately recognised for their work. In relation to the coordination question, arguably, I'm someone who's moved into more of a coordination role over the years, and I think there has to be a space and place made for people to do that, and to feel that that is recognised in its own right and valued in its own right. And that's probably a long game to achieve that, but I think that's where we need to get to. And things like the resume are part of that process, I think.
Thank you. Graham?
Can I pick up on the question of careers that span the academic, business and policy worlds? I mean, I observe, and others may take a different view, but I observe that it is easier to move between these domains at the start of a career and near the end of a career than it is during the middle of a career. And I think it's worth exploring why that is and whether that is a healthy place to be. The other observation I'd offer is that there is not, although this is asked as one question, it's actually a whole lot of subtopics, and the answers vary according to which axis you're on. Just a few days ago, the government announced that in future positions in the senior civil service will all be exposed to open competition. That suggests that they are open to fields of recruits from the academic and business world on a scale that has not been available previously. So it suggests that at least in terms of openness to candidates, there is a shift taking place. And I would say that there is at least a bit of empirical evidence that universities are more open to appointments from people that have career experience in business and the policy world, rather than assuming that every position is filled by promotion from an academic. So there's bits of movement going on. There are bits of it that are easier and more difficult. I think that we are far from optimal here.
Thank you. Now I'm going to take a last set of questions from this side of the room. We didn't get a go before, and then if they can be, we'll then turn to our panelists for their final round of comments. Yes.
Leslie Thompson from Elsevier, and I have the scars and the rewards of supporting interdisciplinary research from the predecessor to UKRI, including with Declan and George Rada, discipline hopping, and then Centres for Doctoral Training. My observation over many years is the success of interdisciplinary research depends on generous spirit. Generous spirit in peer review, and more importantly, generous leadership and psychological safety in research teams. I work in many environments. The one thing I think is quite lacking in academia, and I apologise, is a psychological safety for research groups. And I think that is something we really need to think hard about.
Very interesting, tying in with some of what we were hearing about earlier from Rachel. Now, is there anybody else on that side of the... Yes, I see another hand raised. Yes, there.
Thank you. Jaideep Gupte, Director of Research at the Arts and Humanities Research Council. First of all, Otlin, I'd like to absolutely agree with your observation around truth, the sort of friendship and trust that's so important in rebuilding what we potentially lost in terms of the ODA cuts. My question was around the scales of funding and appropriate scales of funding for interdisciplinarity, and all of you touched upon this in your comments. You know, at one level, there's this, and I obviously at AHRC, being the smallest council, I spend a lot of my time thinking about the appropriate scales at which we can support interdisciplinary work. At one level, interdisciplinarity is seen as high risk and therefore quite expensive. But also at another, the very large scales of funding tend to crowd out some of the disciplines that are used to operating at much smaller scales. So how do we balance that out, and are there appropriate scales of funding?
Thank you very much. I'm just seeing if there are any other questions here. Well, I'm going to add one final question, and then we will ask our panelists to weigh up, which is really going back to Graham's opening observations when he tried very carefully to make the case for disciplines and to ask people if they've got any observations on a bit of legislation that is heading down the track at the moment on freedom of speech in universities. And although what gets all the attention is the wider issue of freedom of speech and how students, unions and others treat visiting speakers, there is a second strand of that legislation, which is the concept of academic freedom. And a government is embarking on the bold project of trying to write academic freedom into primary legislation. And academic freedom exists within disciplines. Clearly the thinking behind this legislation is that you have to have, academics need a special freedom to speak out within their discipline, which doesn't give them the same entitlement to speak out in other areas completely unrelated to their discipline. And the structure of disciplines, I do think we need, and part of how disciplines work, the freedom of academic freedom is also partly the autonomy of disciplines to shape and police themselves. And indeed, sometimes progress takes the form of a discipline excluding what it regards as bogus or illegitimate work within its discipline. The evolutionary battles in the southern states of America, the Scopes trial was scientists refusing to accept that creationism was part of the scientific discipline and saying nobody can require us to teach this. So part of how you protect a discipline is by what you exclude. And there is quite a framework of thinking about academic discipline. And oddly enough, it may be through the accident of this legislation. So I'm thinking about how this focus on interdisciplinarity relates to a quite established set of views around disciplines and how they police themselves, I think is going to come up in legislation. And so if anybody wishes to comment on that, you may. And commenting on that is a condition for getting your glass of white wine after. But then there's also some other very important questions. Otterlin, why don't we start with you? Your observation.
Yes, really interesting set of things. Just very quickly, I want to talk about scale. I think diversity, I think interdisciplinary work, just as disciplinary work, needs a range of different funding mechanisms at a range of different scales, depending on what it is you want to do. You can do fantastic interdisciplinary work with you know, a PhD student and a pencil. It doesn't require a huge thing. But also, some of the enormous global challenges will need much bigger, it just depends. So I actually think keeping that kind of horses for courses is important. But I think I'd like to try to bring together the comments about generosity and psychological safety with these comments on freedom of speech. Because I think freedom of speech in a psychologically safe environment with generosity is a wonderful thing. Freedom of speech that's about polemic and hatred is not a wonderful thing, because it precisely excludes other people in a way that is not valuable. So I'm really interested in how you build those kinds of environments. I want to tell one story about Uri Alon in Israel, who's a systems biologist. He's also involved in improvisational theatre, and he uses improvisational theatre techniques in his research group, we're back to creativity and imagination, to support those kinds of discussions. And the absolute classic, which I recommend to everybody, is yes and. Somebody puts an idea in, you can't say no but, you can't even say yes but, you can only say yes and. And I think that's a really simple and valuable tool which absolutely speaks to this question of freedom of speech. If somebody says something to you that you find challenging and you say yes and, then you're bringing into a discussion. If freedom of speech is about the right to be rude and objectionable, that's a whole different thing, because that shuts down debate. And it's how you create environments that welcome debate through yes and that I think is what we need to do, and what the point of institutions like universities should be.
Yeah, absolutely. David?
Well, I'd like to take up this point about friendship, about getting on well, about the type of institutions that you can do that in. I've become more and more interested in looking at the way a lot of innovation works, about the really critical nature of the ordinary social relationship between people, and that far from, as it were, the economics of utility and etc., the fact that people get on well with each other plays a massive role in how pretty much every organisation I'm involved in works. But we'd hardly talk about it at all. It's very fascinating, and it's something which I'm very, in looking at these sort of relatively small relation decision-making based graduate intensive groups, this role of people getting on well with each other, actually enjoying each other's company. And you can of course see it, because also if you look at lots of high value added service sector companies, there's a bar, and there are places people go and have drinks and so on. It's very clear that people who, as it were, are responsible for these things actually see people getting on well together as a very critical part of the way we work. And I've working on in research groups, particularly cross-national research groups, it's absolutely critical for enough people to get on well with each other for the thing to actually work.
A very interesting theme emerging here, and one that you touched on in your opening remarks, Rachel.
So if I think about the question about disciplines regulating themselves.
Oh yes.
So to me, that's an interesting conundrum, and it's a conundrum because the notion of disciplines regulating themselves implies that we know what a discipline is, or the disciplines have boundaries that are in some way enacted and maintained. And I'm not sure that's always the case. And I think that there would be debates about where disciplinary boundaries lie, and the beauty of interdisciplinarity is the ability to work across those boundaries and to sometimes blur them. So I think fundamental to the question that you asked about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, is understanding actually in the first instance what we mean by disciplines.
And but do you think that disciplines are a useful part of research and academia? Do you think that the people's the boundaries are fuzzy interdisciplinary working is valuable, but there is a sort of body of something called physics or something called history, and it's hard to imagine a world where that kind of shaped body of knowledge and research programs of the future don't exist, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I'd echo some of the words from Graham in Graham's talk about the importance of disciplines and the basis that they provide for so much of what we do in research. So maybe that's a good moment to pass over to Graham.
Graham.
I was going to, I mean, what a marvellous range of issues. I was really wanting to turn to the generosity of spirit and the psychological safety point that Leslie Thompson raised. And I do that because I feel as if I was the beneficiary of this on a significant scale when UCL took a bet on me, hiring me from some years in the civil service. And I think, and I've thought for a while about, you know, what was it that caused them to have that faith or confidence or appetite for risk or whatever it was. And I think some of it was about the self-confidence of a reasonably successful institution and the scale of a reasonably large institution where one individual could only pose so much risk. But in among the...
That would have been quite a lot, Graham.
I got a lot of really good advice when I landed at UCL at first. But one of the things that stuck in my mind came from David Price, who was then Vice Provost for Research. And he said to me, don't try to be the smartest person in the room. You won't pull that off.
Right.
But you might be the kindest person in the room. So why not try for that one? And I thought that was great advice. And I actually encountered role models again and again and again and started to think, actually, that's what I want to be.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we've
very good.
We've had a wonderful set of exchanges. Thank you very much for people who've participated online, here in this room, and of course to our panelists, and leading us to some very deep reflections on both the importance of diversity, including sort of neurodiversity, diversity of opinion, but also some sense of the importance of shared values about how we communicate and work together even when we are so diverse. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
David, that was a super discussion.
How they're going to measure the success of this from 22 to 27 beats me.